The Stolen Generation. Stolen Generation was characterized by legally binding government legislations which was influenced by the assimilation policy that allowed the Aboriginal Protection Board to separate Indigenous children from their families without having to prove neglect in court, affecting approximately 100,000 half-caste Aboriginal children. Short-term consequences included trauma, emotional distress, cultural disruption, and educational challenges. Long-term repercussions of the Stolen Generation included intergenerational trauma, loss of culture, and a variety of health disparities. Thousands of children were forcibly removed by government, churches, and welfare bodies to be raised in institutions, fostered out, or adopted by non-Indigenous families nationally and internationally. They are known as the Stolen Generation. These children were considered half-caste, or children who were Aboriginal and white, as they believed they could breed the Aboriginal out of them. Genocide progressed and unfolded in stages throughout the years, starting with the Aborigines Protection Act in Victoria 1896, establishing an Aborigines Protection Board in Victoria to manage the interests of Aboriginals. The Governor can order the removal of any children from their families to a reformatory or industrial school. Other states followed, with all having similar laws by 1911, as well as New South Wales making an addition in 1915 allowing the Aboriginal Protection Board to separate Indigenous children from their families without having to establish in court that they were neglected. The underlying factors that contributed to this genocide was the racist beliefs and attitudes held against the Aboriginals, with many non-Indigenous Australians viewing Indigenous culture and practices as inferior, believing that removing Indigenous children was a way to civilise them, relating to the ideology held that the British teaching and raising method was superior. Methods of abduction included scoutings and searches, with examples of officers coming out to people's homes looking for Aboriginal children and taking them away, as well as abducting children on their way to school, not allowing families to even have farewells with their children, and for most, the morning before being the last time they would ever see them again. It is estimated that at least 100,000 children were stolen and misplaced throughout the extent of the Stolen Generation. This can be seen in the source, showing a scene from the rabbit-proof fence, reenacting an example of children being taken away and the trauma it caused. Genocide related to the 1948 Convention, the 10 stages of genocide strongly in stages such as classification, from the classification of half-caste children, discrimination in discriminating the Aboriginals, dehumanization by dehumanizing the stolen children through various unhuman acts, persecution as the children suffered hostility and ill treatment, and denial from Australia, still holding large disregard to the entire genocide. This genocide also falls under the 2nd and 5th Acts of the United Nations definition of genocide, as it caused serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, as well as forcibly transferring children of the group to another. This is shown in primary source B with an extract from an Aboriginal mother's diary reporting on how her children were taken from in front of her and the trauma and pain caused by this. Long-term impacts consisted of trauma/emotional distress, cultural disruption, and educational challenges. Long-term impacts consisted of cultural loss, intergenerational trauma, and health disparities. Trauma and emotional distress was created for multiple reasons, such as forced separation, loss of family and communication bonds, and the racism and discrimination they were faced with. Cultural disruptions resulted in many children losing their language, cultural practices, and knowledge of their custom traditions. This disruption of cultural connection has had a profound impact on their identity and sense of belonging. The Aboriginal children struggle with education for multiple reasons, such as disruptions from their previous education, inadequate educational facilities, and denial of their cultural education. In most cases, Indigenous languages, traditions, and cultural practices were actively discouraged or prohibited. This is highlighted in the newspaper source with the written caption underneath, talking about how they wanted the strongest child so they can put them straight to work, effectively ending their schooling education permanently. Long-term impacts of cultural loss are still apparent today, with lack of tradition being carried through generations from reasons such as disconnection from family and community, loss of traditional knowledge, and limited access to cultural resources. Intergenerational trauma is being experienced heavily as a result of emotional and psychological damage from Aboriginals feeling abandoned, devastated, and bewildered. In their new homes and schools, they were frequently exposed to abuse, neglect, and cultural oppression, leaving them with long-lasting emotional scars. These traumatic experiences were handed down to their children and grandchildren, resulting in a cycle of trauma. Health disparities are still appearing from the Stolen Generation, such as 1 in every 7 current Stolen Generation survivors suffering from a disability. Causes came from physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, which were unfortunately common. leading to long-term physical and psychological disabilities. The Bringing Them Home report covers an abundance of testimonies backing up the information, as well as other long-term impacts with equal severity. In conclusion, the Stolen Generation was an event where hundreds of thousands of children were forcibly removed by governments, churches, and welfare bodies to be raised in institutions, fostered out or adopted by non-Indigenous families, nationally and internationally. They are known as the Stolen Generation. This came with leaving an abundance of negative, short and long-term impacts.